Sirens split the thick, sticky July night like a blade through wet silk. Red and blue lights painted the polished silver flanks of a late-model Mercedes-Benz S-Class in frantic, alternating strokes. Behind the wheel sat a man whose quiet authority could bend rooms of powerful people without raising his voice. The aggressive young patrol officer swaggering toward the open window had no idea, none at all, that in exactly 72 hours, his entire career, his freedom, and the rest of his life would rest solely in the hands of the man he was about to humiliate. Rain sheeted across the quiet asphalt of Hawthorne Drive in the exclusive hills of Scarsdale, Westchester County, New York. Towering oaks dripped onto wrought iron gates and manicured lawns that cost more than most people earn in a decade. Arthur Pendleton rubbed his eyes with the heels of both hands, feeling the bone-deep ache of a 14-hour day settle into his shoulders. At 58, he still carried the weight of the federal bench as if it were part of his skeleton. Tonight he wanted only 3 things: a warm meal, a glass of the aged bourbon waiting on his sideboard, and the soft mattress of the bed he shared with no one but the quiet. He guided the Mercedes through the familiar curves, the soft melancholy of Miles Davis drifting from the premium speakers. He wore a faded Harvard Law sweatshirt, class of '91, and soft gray cotton sweatpants. Hours earlier, he had peeled off the charcoal bespoke suit, the starched collar, and the silk tie in the private chambers of the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. The robes stayed hanging on the carved oak rack. The man beneath them simply wanted to go home. He was less than a mile from the long circular driveway of 442 Hawthorne Drive when the headlights of a police cruiser bloomed in his rearview mirror. Arthur had not been speeding. He had not swerved. Registration was current, taillights perfect, every light and signal working as designed. Still, the cruiser closed the distance until its push bumper nearly kissed his trunk. Then the red and blue strobes detonated the peaceful darkness. Arthur sighed, the sound low and tired. He clicked the turn signal, eased the big sedan onto the shoulder, and shifted into park. He rolled the window halfway down, switched on the cabin dome light so every movement would be visible, and placed both large hands on the leather wheel at 10 and 2. It was a practiced ritual, learned decades earlier when he was still a young black man driving through neighborhoods that decided his guilt before he ever spoke. Heavy boots slapped through rain puddles. Officer Bradley Jenkins of the 42nd Precinct swaggered up to the driver's door, right hand resting on the butt of his Glock. Jenkins was late 20s, built like a fire hydrant that had been stuffed into a uniform. High and tight haircut, permanent sneer. The kind of cop who measured his day by how thoroughly he could make someone smaller. His reputation inside the precinct was simple: hardliner, intimidator, absolute compliance or consequences. License, registration, and proof of insurance. Now, Jenkins barked, ramming the tactical flashlight straight into Arthur's eyes. Arthur squinted, turning his face a fraction. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I was pulled over? I don't answer to you." Jenkins leaned in, voice dripping contempt. "I said license and registration. Are you deaf or just stupid?" Arthur's jaw tightened once, a microscopic movement no one but another judge would notice. Years of controlling explosive courtrooms had given him oceans of patience, yet the raw disrespect still scraped like sandpaper. "My wallet is in my right rear pocket. Registration is in the glove box. I'm going to reach for the wallet first." "Move slow," Jenkins ordered, fingers tightening on the pistol grip. Arthur retrieved the worn leather wallet, slid out the New York driver's license, and offered it through the window. Jenkins snatched it, held it under the light, then looked from the photo to the man in the sweatshirt to the buttery leather interior of the Mercedes. A ugly, cynical smirk twisted his mouth. Arthur Pendleton. He read the name as if tasting something sour, deliberately stripping away any title. Pretty expensive ride for a guy dressed like a vagrant, Artie. Whose car is this? You steal it from one of these nice houses? The vehicle is registered in my name, officer. You'll see that when I retrieve the paperwork. Again, I would like to know the legal justification for this stop. You were drifting over the yellow line, Jenkins lied without hesitation. And you look suspicious. You don't belong in this neighborhood. I have lived at 442 Hawthorne Drive for 15 years, Arthur answered, voice dropping into the natural register of quiet command he used every day from the bench. It is 3 blocks from where we are currently parked. Jenkins barked a sharp, mocking laugh. Yeah, right. Step out of the vehicle. On what grounds? I have provided identification. I am not under arrest. There is no probable cause for detention or search. I said step out of the damn car, Jenkins roared, yanking the door open hard enough that the hinges protested. Before Arthur could unbuckle, the younger man lunged in, seized a fistful of the Harvard sweatshirt, and hauled the older man bodily out into the freezing rain. Arthur's knees cracked against wet asphalt. Before he could find his balance, Jenkins spun him, slammed him chest first against the Mercedes, and kicked his legs wide. Cold steel handcuffs ratcheted shut around Arthur's wrists, biting deep enough to draw a thin line of blood. You people always think you can talk your way out of things, Jenkins hissed into his ear, breath thick with stale coffee and chewing tobacco. You think because you're driving a fancy stolen car, you're untouchable. Know your place, boy. Out here, I'm the law. You're nothing. Arthur stood perfectly still. Rain ran from his graying hair into his eyes. He did not struggle. He did not shout. He simply turned his head until his eyes locked with Jenkins's. I will comply with your orders, Officer Jenkins, he said softly, memorizing the nameplate and badge number. But I assure you this interaction will be scrutinized on a level you cannot begin to fathom. Shut up! Jenkins shoved him toward the cruiser. You're going downtown for resisting arrest and failure to comply. Let's see how tough you are in a holding cell. For the rest of that long night, Arthur Pendleton remained silent. He did not demand a phone call. He did not raise his voice for a lawyer. When the desk sergeant booked him, fingerprints, mugshot, the confiscation of wallet, keys, and the gold watch his late wife had given him, Arthur answered every question with quiet precision. He knew the system better than anyone wearing a badge in that fluorescent-lit precinct. Reveal who he was now, and the entire incident would vanish. Body cam footage mysteriously corrupted, hollow apologies offered, careers protected. Arthur did not want an apology. He wanted absolute, undeniable justice. On the cold concrete bench of the holding cell, while drunken voices rammed against the walls, Judge Arthur Pendleton of the Southern District of New York began, in the quiet of his mind, to build his case. Morning light knifed through the dusty blinds of the 42nd Precinct bullpen. Officer Bradley Jenkins lounged in his rolling chair, boots propped on the desk, regaling 2 rookies with the exaggerated tale of last night's conquest. I'm telling you, the guy thought he was some kind of hotshot, Jenkins boasted, sipping bitter coffee. $100,000 Mercedes, sweatpants, starts getting lippy about probable cause, like he binge-watched Law and Order. I snatched him right out of the seat, put him in his place real quick. What did the sergeant say? One rookie asked, eyes wide. Booked him resisting and disorderly. Honestly, I haven't even finished the narrative yet. DA'll probably knock it to a misdemeanor, but the point was made. You don't disrespect the badge in my sector. Jenkins checked his heavy steel watch, swung his boots down, and stood. Today was not for petty traffic arrests. Today was the day that would make him. For 18 months, he had been the street-level anchor of Operation Ironclad, the sprawling federal RICO case against the Romano crime syndicate that controlled the docks from Red Hook to the Jersey side. Jenkins had been first through the warehouse door on the night they seized 60 kilos of product, a crate of unserialized firearms, and the syndicate's encrypted ledgers. His body cam footage and chain of custody testimony were the linchpins. Perform well on the stand, and the chief had already promised him the gold detective's shield. He changed into a sharp navy suit, slicked his hair, and admired himself in the locker room mirror. He felt invincible. An hour later, he strode beneath the soaring marble columns of the Daniel Patrick Moynihan United States Courthouse in Lower Manhattan. The federal building was a cathedral compared with the grimy municipal courts he usually haunted. Terrazzo floors, vaulted ceilings, the heavy hush of real power. Assistant United States Attorney Sarah Collins paced outside Courtroom 4B, a thick stack of folders clutched to her chest. She was razor-sharp, 38, and had spent 4 years building the Romano case from nothing. She looked up as Jenkins approached, eyes scanning the suit. "Officer Jenkins, you're late. Traffic was a nightmare, counselor. Don't worry, I'm locked and loaded. Chain of custody is pristine. We're putting these guys away for life." Sarah did not smile. Pale and exhausted, she stepped close. "Listen carefully. The Romano defense attorneys are sharks. Combined hourly rate higher than your yearly salary. They will come after your character, your history, your temperament. You cannot let them bait you. I've testified 100 times, not in this courtroom, and not in front of this judge. We got a last-minute reassignment this morning. Judge Harrison had a medical emergency. The man we drew is a legend. Brilliant. Zero tolerance for police misconduct or perjury. Step out of line, and he will not just strike your testimony. He will hold you in contempt and put you in federal lockup." "I got it. Who is he anyway?" Before she could answer, the massive mahogany doors swung open. The bailiff's voice rolled out like thunder. "Court is in session. All parties for United States versus Romano, please enter." Jenkins puffed his chest, straightened his tie, and walked into the packed courtroom. Oak pews filled with reporters, federal agents, and the curious. At the defense table, 3 stone-faced mobsters sat flanked by a small army of $1,000 suits. Jenkins took his seat behind the prosecution table, adrenaline singing. "All rise." Every person stood. The door behind the elevated bench opened. A tall, broad-shouldered man in flowing black robes entered with quiet, terrifying grace. "The United States District Court for the Southern District of New York is now in session. The Honorable Judge Arthur Pendleton presiding. God save the United States and this honorable court." Jenkins's heart simply stopped. The name landed like a stone in still water. He watched the judge ascend the bench, turn, and face the room. Overhead, lights caught every deep line of that stern face. All the blood left Jenkins's head. His stomach dropped into a black well. His hands began to shake against the polished wood. Sitting high above him, eyes cold as a winter storm over the Hudson, was the man he had dragged out of a Mercedes, handcuffed in the rain, and thrown into a concrete cell 72 hours earlier. Judge Arthur Pendleton lifted the wooden gavel and brought it down with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. "Be seated," he said, eyes locked on Officer Bradley Jenkins. "We have a great deal of work to do today." Absolute silence held Courtroom 4B as Judge Pendleton arranged the thick stack of briefs on his mahogany desk. His face was an unreadable mask of judicial neutrality. Not a flicker betrayed the violence and humiliation of Hawthorne Drive. From his high seat he surveyed the room, jury box, defense table, and finally the prosecution's star witness. Bradley Jenkins felt cold paralysis crawl out of his chest and into his fingertips. His stomach churned a toxic mix of precinct coffee and pure terror. He tried to swallow and found only sand. The man in the black robes was the same man he had treated like a common vagrant. Sarah Collins, oblivious to the catastrophe unfolding inside her witness, approached the podium. "Your Honor, the United States calls Officer Bradley Jenkins to the stand." Jenkins did not move. He sat frozen, eyes locked on the judge. 3 seconds. 5. people in the gallery shifted. "Officer Jenkins," Judge Pendleton said, deep baritone rolling off the vaulted ceiling. "The government has called you. Approach the witness stand and be sworn. Now." Shaking, Jenkins stood. His legs felt like poured concrete. Every footstep on the terrazzo sounded like a funeral drum. He raised a trembling right hand. The bailiff administered the oath. Jenkins's voice cracked on the words, "I do." He sat in the wooden box, less than 4 feet from the man who held his future. Sarah tried a warm smile. "Officer Jenkins, state your full name and current assignment for the record." "Bradley Thomas Jenkins, patrol officer, 42nd Precinct, currently assigned to the Joint Federal Task Force for Organized Crime." For 30 careful minutes, Sarah walked him through the warehouse raid of October 14th. Jenkins recited the practiced lines: breach, perimeter, discovery of the encrypted ledgers. But his delivery was wreckage. He stuttered, lost the thread, darted panicked glances at the bench. Every time he spoke of securing evidence or following protocol, Judge Pendleton leaned forward a fraction of an inch, and Jenkins's spine turned to ice. Sarah noticed the unraveling and tried to throw him a line. "Officer, you are certain you maintain the chain of custody for the Romano ledger. You followed every departmental regulation and violated no constitutional rights during the seizure." Before Jenkins could answer, the judge's voice cut the air like a steel blade. "Counselor, let us allow the witness to answer without leading. Officer Jenkins, you are under oath. You are testifying that your adherence to constitutional rights and departmental protocol is flawless. Is that correct?" The double meaning crushed the oxygen from the room. Cold sweat rolled down Jenkins's temple. He knew exactly what the judge was doing, building a trap on the federal record. "Yes, Your Honor," he croaked. "I always follow protocol." Pendleton stared for a long, agonizing moment, then made a single deliberate note with his gold fountain pen. "The court notes your sworn statement. You may proceed, Ms. Collins." Sarah finished direct examination shortly after, disturbed but still believing the basic facts were safe. She sat. The real trial was only beginning. Judge Pendleton turned to the defense table. "Mr. Caldwell, you may begin your cross-examination." Richard Caldwell rose. Silver hair, $1,000 suit, the kind of legal predator who ate police witnesses for breakfast. He buttoned his jacket, picked up a thick red folder, and walked slowly to the podium with a predator's smile. "Thank you, Your Honor." He faced Jenkins. "Officer, you have painted quite a picture. A diligent, by-the-book officer who respects the law. I think we need to look a little closer at the artist before we trust the painting. Wouldn't you agree?" Jenkins gripped the edges of the stand until his knuckles went white. He was aware of the 12 citizens in the jury box, of the Romano lieutenants who would order a hit without blinking, and above all of the silent executioner 4 feet away. Caldwell opened the red file. "During direct, you testified under penalty of perjury that you have a flawless record of respecting constitutional rights. You always follow protocol. Do you stand by that absolute statement?" "I do." "Fascinating." Caldwell produced a sheet. "Because I have here your internal affairs file, obtained by subpoena this morning. 7 separate citizen complaints in 3 years. Excessive force, unlawful detention, racial profiling. Are you familiar with these documents?" Sarah shot to her feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. This is a RICO trial, not a disciplinary hearing. The file is highly prejudicial." Jenkins felt a desperate flicker of hope. If the judge sustained, Pendleton never looked at the prosecutor. His eyes stayed fixed on the trembling officer. Overruled. The government has built its entire chain of custody on the credibility and integrity of this specific officer. If he has a documented history of constitutional violations, the jury has an absolute right to weigh that history against his current testimony. "Proceed, Mr. Caldwell." Sarah sank back, face pale. She had never seen a federal judge grant such latitude without a fight in chambers. Caldwell smiled, smelling blood. Thank you, Your Honor. Let's talk about your temperament. Let's talk about your deep, abiding respect for the law. In fact, we don't even need to go back 3 years. Let's go back merely 72 hours. Where were you on the night of July 5th between 10 and midnight? Jenkins felt the floor vanish. A high-pitched ringing filled his ears. He had never finished the arrest report. The paperwork still sat unfinished on his desk, ready to be quietly downgraded. I was on patrol, he stammered. On patrol in the affluent Hawthorne Drive neighborhood of Scarsdale, far outside your usual sector. And while on patrol, you initiated a traffic stop of a silver Mercedes-Benz. Under oath, what was your probable cause? The vehicle was drifting over the yellow line. Drifting. Caldwell raised an eyebrow. I have here the GPS telematics data from that exact Mercedes, subpoenaed from the manufacturer. The vehicle traveled at the posted speed limit, maintained its lane flawlessly, used its turn signal perfectly. The data completely contradicts your sworn testimony. Did you fabricate your probable cause, Officer Jenkins? Objection! Sarah's voice cracked with panic. Defense is ambushing the witness with an entirely unrelated stop. Overruled, Ms. Collins. Pendleton's voice boomed with terrifying authority. Credibility is always on trial in this courtroom. Officer Jenkins, answer the question. Did you fabricate the probable cause for that traffic stop? Jenkins was hyperventilating. Walls closed in. Admit the lie and the Romano case collapsed. Federal perjury charges followed. Stick to the lie and he committed perjury in front of the man he had unlawfully arrested. I believed he was drifting, he whispered. You believed? Caldwell's mockery was surgical. After you pulled over a citizen who had committed no crime, he provided identification. He was polite, compliant, well within his rights. How did you respond? Did you issue a warning? A citation? Caldwell turned his back on Jenkins and faced the packed gallery, voice rising to fill the marble hall. You dragged a 58-year-old man out of his vehicle. You threw him against the side of his car, handcuffed him in freezing rain, and arrested him without a shred of legal justification. You told him, and I quote from the precinct holding cell logs where you boasted to the desk sergeant, to know his place. Tell me, officer, what exactly is the place of an innocent citizen who knows his constitutional rights? The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers. Reporters scribbled frantically. Sarah buried her face in her hands as her entire case disintegrated. Pendleton banged the gavel once. Silence fell like a guillotine. He leaned over the high bench until his face was perilously close to the witness stand. Officer Jenkins, he said softly, the lethal quiet more terrifying than any shout. Before you answer Mr. Caldwell's question, I want to remind you of the gravity of this venue. You are sitting in a federal courtroom. You are sitting in my federal courtroom. I strongly suggest you think very, very carefully about your next words. Because the truth, no matter how deeply you try to bury it, always finds its way into the light. Sweat poured down Jenkins's face in cold rivulets, soaking the starched collar of his navy suit. He sat trapped, paralyzed. Directly in front of him stood Caldwell, holding the red folder of his destruction. To his left sat the silent architect of his doom. I am waiting for an answer, officer, Caldwell pressed. You told an innocent, compliant citizen to know his place. Articulate for the jury and for the court what you meant by that highly specific phrase. Jenkins opened his mouth. Only a dry rasp emerged. He looked desperately toward the prosecution table. Sarah sat rigid, color gone, offering no lifeline. She simply stared in unadulterated horror. I was just securing the scene, Jenkins finally stammered. High-stress environment. Dark. I didn't know who he was or what he was capable of. A high-stress environment. Caldwell laughed sharply and turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, it was a quiet, affluent suburban street. The driver was a 58-year-old man in sweatpants listening to jazz. He handed you his identification and calmly asked why he was being detained. In response, you physically assaulted him. Caldwell walked back to his table and lifted a small digital drive. Your Honor, the defense offers Exhibit D, the raw, unedited body camera footage from Officer Jenkins's uniform on the night of July 5th, subpoenaed from the precinct servers at 3 this morning. Sarah closed her eyes, silently mourning her career. Admitted, Judge Pendleton said firmly. Bailiff, activate the monitors. Large screens descended from the ceiling. Courtroom lights dimmed. Jenkins gripped the railing so hard his knuckles ached. He was about to watch his professional execution in high definition. The footage began, red and blue strobes painting the silver Mercedes, rain hissing on audio. The entire courtroom watched Jenkins approach aggressively, flashlight in the driver's face. His own voice filled the room, loud, arrogant, dripping with racist condescension. I don't answer to you. I said license and registration. Are you deaf or just stupid? Gasps rippled through the gallery. Reporters typed furiously. The video showed the driver, face partially obscured by camera angle, remaining perfectly calm, polite, completely compliant. The jury heard him explain his residence, state his rights, ask for legal justification. Then they watched in horror as Jenkins ripped the door open, hauled the older man out by the collar, slammed him against wet metal, and aggressively ratcheted handcuffs onto his wrists. And then the most damning phrase echoed through the state-of-the-art speakers. You think because you're driving a fancy stolen car that you're untouchable? Know your place, boy. Out here, I'm the law. You're nothing. Caldwell paused the video on Jenkins's sneering face. The silence that followed was heavy, toxic, absolute. Jurors looked at the officer with undisguised disgust. Even the hardened Romano defendants exchanged glances of pure bewilderment. You're the law, Caldwell repeated softly, walking toward the stand. You told him he was nothing. Officer Jenkins, you sit here today asking this jury to believe your testimony, to believe you meticulously followed constitutional protocol when securing evidence against my clients. Yet less than 3 days ago, you fabricated probable cause, committed battery against a peaceful citizen, unlawfully detained him, and hurled racial slurs at him simply because he drove a nice car. Jenkins was hyperventilating. That was an isolated incident. I had a bad night. It has nothing to do with this case. The Romano evidence is clean. Is it? Caldwell roared, slamming a hand on the podium. If you are willing to lie on an official police report to cover up your violent abuse of power on a Tuesday, why in God's name should this jury believe you aren't lying on a Thursday to secure a federal conviction? He took a breath, adjusted his lapels, and looked up at the judge, a man he deeply respected, knowing the monumental restraint Pendleton was exercising. Officer Jenkins, Caldwell said, voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Do you know who the man in that Mercedes was? Did you ever bother to read the identification he handed you before you threw him in a cage? Jenkins looked around the room, completely broken. I don't remember. Allow me to refresh your memory. Caldwell turned his back. Your Honor, I have no further questions for this thoroughly corrupt, fundamentally dishonest witness. Whispers erupted like wildfire. Reporters climbed over one another. Pendleton lifted the heavy gavel and struck twice. The sharp cracks restored absolute silence. Sarah Collins stood slowly, looking physically ill. Months of work, thousands of hours of surveillance, millions of taxpayer dollars, incinerated by the arrogance of one dirty cop. She knew her ethical duty. Your Honor, she said, voice shaking, then steadying. The government is utterly appalled by the evidence presented today. We cannot in good conscience proceed with Officer Jenkins as our witness. The United States respectfully moves to strike the entirety of Officer Jenkins's testimony from the official record. Pendleton nodded, face an impenetrable fortress. The motion to strike is granted. The jury is instructed to completely disregard all testimony provided by Officer Bradley Jenkins. Jenkins felt his career evaporate. The gold shield, the Romano case, everything, gone. He began to rise, desperate to flee. "Sit down, officer," Pendleton commanded. The force of the order buckled Jenkins's knees. He dropped heavily back into the chair. "Your Honor, I have been dismissed as a witness," Jenkins whimpered. "You have been dismissed by the prosecution," Pendleton corrected, dark eyes locking on. "You have not been dismissed by this court. We are not finished." The judge folded his large hands on the towering bench and looked down at the trembling man who had stripped him of dignity, assaulted him in the rain, and thrown him into a concrete cell. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The quiet certainty was infinitely more devastating than any shout. "Officer Jenkins, you took an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States. You swore to protect and serve your community. Instead, you have demonstrated a staggering, systemic rot. You operate under the delusion that a badge grants you immunity from the very laws you are tasked with enforcing. You stalked a citizen, fabricated a legal justification to detain him, physically assaulted him, and then stood in my courtroom under penalty of perjury and lied about it to a federal jury." Jenkins was openly weeping, silent tears tracking through sweat. He shook his head frantically. "I didn't know who he was. That is precisely the point." Pendleton's voice cracked like a whip. "It does not matter who he was. Whether he was a sanitation worker, a high school teacher, a mechanic, or a federal judge, his constitutional rights remain exactly the same. You did not abuse a title. You abused a human being." He leaned forward. Overhead lights carved deep shadows across his face. "You told that citizen to know his place. You told him he was nothing. You felt absolute power because you held the handcuffs and the weapon. You assumed that because he was a black man in a wealthy neighborhood, he was inherently criminal. You stripped him of his humanity simply because you could." Jenkins buried his face in his hands, shattered. "Well, Officer Jenkins," Pendleton continued, voice resonating with ultimate authority, "allow me to introduce myself properly. I am the Honorable Arthur Pendleton, and the man you dragged out of that Mercedes, the man you assaulted in the rain, the man you threw into a holding cell, was me." A collective, deafening gasp erupted from the jury box. Several jurors physically recoiled. The Romano defendants stared in sheer disbelief. Even the seasoned bailiffs looked stunned. Jenkins slowly lowered his hands, bloodshot eyes wide. The realization hit with the force of a freight train. He had not merely assaulted a civilian. He had violently arrested the presiding federal judge of the Southern District of New York. "Your Honor, please, I'm so sorry," he begged, voice breaking into a sob. "I'll resign. I'll turn in my badge today. Please." "You will not resign," Pendleton stated coldly, "because you are no longer a police officer. Bradley Jenkins, you are hereby found in direct criminal contempt of this federal court for flagrant perjury on the witness stand." He picked up his pen and signed a document with sharp, deliberate strokes. "Furthermore, I am drafting an immediate referral to the United States Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. I am officially recommending you be indicted for federal civil rights violations under Title 18, Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law, as well as federal perjury. You are a disgrace to the uniform, and you are a danger to the public." Pendleton looked past the weeping man to the armed federal marshals at the rear of the courtroom. "United States Marshals," he ordered, voice echoing like the wrath of God. "Take this man into federal custody." Heavy combat boots pounded the terrazzo as three massive marshals sprinted down the center aisle. They descended on the witness box. Jenkins went limp as they hauled him from the chair. "Know your place, Mr. Jenkins," Judge Pendleton said softly, as the marshals ratcheted heavy steel handcuffs onto the corrupt officer's wrists. Jenkins was marched down the center aisle, paraded before the disgusted jury, the stunned gallery, and the flashing cameras of the press. He wept hysterically, expensive suit rumpled, dignity completely destroyed. He had walked into the federal courthouse as a rising star, an arrogant king of the streets. He left it in chains, facing decades in federal prison, thoroughly dismantled by the quiet, absolute justice of the man he had dared to humiliate. Chaos engulfed the Moynihan courthouse the moment the oak door closed behind the disgraced former officer. Reporters sprinted into the marble corridors, phones already pressed to ears. The destruction of a star witness and the shocking revelation of the judge's identity was the kind of explosive front-page story journalists dreamed about. Inside Courtroom 4B, the atmosphere remained rigidly controlled by the man in black robes. Richard Caldwell, seizing the momentum, stepped back to the podium. His clients grinned, sensing an impending dismissal. "Your Honor, in light of the staggering and unprecedented perjury we have just witnessed, the defense moves for an immediate mistrial with prejudice. The government's entire chain of custody regarding the encrypted ledgers relies heavily on the testimony of a thoroughly corrupt, racist, and violent police officer. If Officer Jenkins is willing to fabricate probable cause and physically assault a federal judge, we cannot trust a single piece of evidence he has touched. This entire case is fatally poisoned." Sarah Collins rose slowly, shoulders heavy. She was a woman of deep integrity and knew exactly what she had to do. She did not attempt the impossible. "The United States concedes that the credibility of our primary responding officer has been irrevocably destroyed," she stated, voice tight with anger at Jenkins. "However, Your Honor, the government argues that the physical evidence, the narcotics, and the illegal firearms were seized by other agents on the scene. We ask for a brief recess to evaluate which charges can still be ethically pursued without relying on Jenkins's tainted reports." Judge Pendleton did not answer immediately. He looked out over the sprawling courtroom, carefully weighing the foundational tenets of the law against grim reality. He was not driven by emotion, revenge, or ego. He was the living embodiment of the Constitution. "Mr. Caldwell, your motion for a mistrial is denied at this time," he ruled, baritone echoing with absolute finality. The smug smiles on the mobsters' faces vanished. "While Officer Jenkins is a disgrace to the badge, I will not unilaterally throw out a massive federal racketeering case without giving the prosecution the opportunity to present untainted evidence. Ms. Collins, you have until tomorrow morning to restructure your case. If you cannot establish a clean chain of custody without relying on that corrupt officer, I will dismiss the charges. Court is in recess." By nightfall, the fallout from Courtroom 4B had triggered a political earthquake. The Department of Justice moved with terrifying speed. Before the evening news broadcasts even began, a heavily armed team of federal agents raided the 42nd Precinct. They seized every hard drive, internal affairs file, and communication log. Police Chief Thomas Callahan was forced to hold a humiliating press conference on the steps of One Police Plaza, publicly suspending 3 other officers who had laughed about Jenkins's unlawful arrest in the holding cell. 72 hours after his arrogant, violent assault on Hawthorne Drive, Bradley Jenkins sat on a cold concrete bench inside the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. He no longer wore a sharply pressed navy suit. He wore a bright orange jumpsuit. Bail had been denied. He was deemed a severe flight risk and a danger to the community. As he stared blankly at the metal bars, the crushing reality of his new life settled in. He was going to federal prison. The very system he had so arrogantly weaponized against the innocent had turned its massive, unrelenting gears against him with flawless precision. Miles away from the gritty federal lockup, Evening rain began to fall once more over the quiet, affluent streets of Scarsdale. Streetlights flickered to life, casting warm gold across wet asphalt. Arthur Pendleton guided his pristine silver Mercedes-Benz S-Class through the familiar winding roads of Hawthorne Drive. Soft, melancholic jazz filled the cabin. He wore the same faded Harvard Law sweatshirt, having shed the heavy judicial robes and the crushing weight of the day. He pulled smoothly into the long, circular driveway of 442, parked, and killed the engine. For a long, silent moment, he simply sat in the darkness, listening to the rhythmic drumming of rain on the roof. He gently rubbed his wrists where the faint purplish bruises from cold steel handcuffs were finally beginning to fade. He had not sought confrontation that night. He had merely demanded the dignity and respect that every single human being rightfully deserved. Arthur opened the car door and stepped out into the cool evening air. He walked up the stone pathway toward the home that had waited for him, a quiet, peaceful man who had reminded a corrupt world that true power does not come from a badge, a weapon, or arrogant intimidation. True power comes from an unwavering, relentless commitment to the truth. Justice is not a privilege, it is an absolute right. Judge Arthur Pendleton proved that the law applies equally to everyone, no matter what badge they wear or what authority they claim to hold. Bradley Jenkins thought he could violently abuse his power in the dark, never realizing he was pulling over the very man who would permanently end his corrupt career in the blinding light of a federal courtroom. If this story of ultimate karma and undeniable justice stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to remember that the truth always finds the light.